Hello and welcome to Hamilton the Podcast. I'm Vinton Bayne.
And I'm Robbie Hurlocker.
Last time we left you with King George finding out that John Adams was going to be the next leader of these United States.
So yeah, John Adams' presidency is not greeted with a lot of optimism by King George III. He comes up and he says, wait, are you talking about that little guy that spoke to me all those years ago?
Right.
I don't even remember. It wasn't that memorable. Was it 1785, right?
Yeah, that poor man, they're going to eat him alive.
Yeah, so this is a reference to when John Adams came to England as a representative of the United States, as the first American ambassador sent to Great Britain in order to negotiate a peace between them and to keep the relationship going. This is the first time that someone does that as a free, independent United States, going to the former mother country and standing in front of King George III. That had to have been a really awkward encounter.
Yeah, I can't imagine how it actually went down. Like, just being there, the tension in the air must have been really thick.
Right, and they depict that incredibly well in the John Adams miniseries that
sure
HBO
do.
did.
It was uncomfortable.
It was uncomfortable. It was tense. It was lots of quiet, lots of slow walking forward, and Adams not quite knowing when to bow multiple times. He has to bow 3 times while approaching the king, and then the king kind of just awkwardly stands there, and it looks like at one point he's going to get kind of teary-eyed at Adams talking about how the United States have left his power, and he's like looking at the United States as a lost son almost that's kind of coming home, but he isn't really coming home. He's just standing there on his own, and he's having to acknowledge that they're independent now, and it's really tense and sad. So that's a small little reference to how we have, as we announced a few weeks ago, we've devoured the John Adams miniseries ourselves.
Yes.
We've gone through this. We are excited to go episode by episode through that particular John Adams miniseries. We'll do that after we go through the Adams administration song in Hamilton the Musical. But if you haven't watched it, it is so worthwhile.
Yeah, it was really well done. And I mean, we'll talk on and on about it, so I won't talk too much about it here.
Exactly.
But where we left you last time was in the middle of that I Know Him song, so we're just going to quickly finish that out. There's not much to talk about here. As we said, he says they're going to eat him alive, and he goes back into that Oceans Rise, Empires Fall. Next to Washington, they all look small, which is true. Washington was one of our taller presidents, and Adams was one of our shorter ones.
Yeah, but he was still only like 5'7", right?
Not too short. We like tall men as presidents.
Yeah, we tend to associate a tall presence with respect, just kind of psychologically, I think.
Yeah,
I don't know
exactly.
if there have been studies into that, but we look at Abraham Lincoln as one of our most respected presidents, and he was the tallest. Which, by the way, I respect you a lot, Vinton, because you happen to be the same height as Abraham Lincoln, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Maybe that's the reason I respect you so much. And the next line in King George III's song, when he starts talking about how they're all alone, watch them run around, they'll tear each other into pieces. Jesus Christ, this will be fun. I almost imagine him like grabbing the popcorn and starting feeding him in his mouth, like as he's just sitting back and watching the chaos that is going to happen.
Exactly.
He does not believe that the United States can sustain that transition of power from one regime of George Washington to the next regime of John Adams, and he just can't imagine a scenario where this is sustainable.
Yeah, and you say that, and that's actually what happens in the staging. At the end of the song here, they pull up this like velvet chair, and he sits down and just crosses his legs and leans back like ready for a show.
Nice. That's so good.
So he goes into that da-da-da-da that he does.
Da-da-da-da.
Then he's going to have this maniacal cackle when he says, President John Adams.
Good luck.
So
I like
that.
that.
I love that condescending tone there.
Right. I love that too. That's one of the lines that on the cast album, Jonathan Groff delivers so well. Everything he does, he delivers very well, but that's right up there with awesome. Wow.
Exactly. Yeah, so that's a great exit for the king here.
Right.
And that's going to take us straight into the song, The Adams Administration.
Yeah, it's a super short song on the track, but it kind of consolidates a whole lot of history into a minute or so.
Right.
So, as often happens in this musical, Aaron Burr steps forward and does the transition scene of the narrating role. So he walks up and he does that typical narration melody that he does with the, how does Hamilton, the short-tempered protean creator of the Coast Guard, founder of the New York Post, ardently abuse his cabinet post, destroy his reputation? Welcome, folks, to the Adams administration. So just in that one stanza alone, he's introducing all of these little bitty things, tidbits of Hamilton history that don't otherwise get fleshed out in this actual musical.
I actually didn't know what the word protean meant. Maybe a lot of other people out there do. But if you wanted to know what it meant, it's basically that you're good at a lot of things. You have great diversity, variety, which knowing what Hamilton has done up till now, him creating the Coast Guard is like, oh, that too?
Yeah.
When were you into things like that? Like, what are you doing?
Yeah, that's kind of a line where Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton fought with each other about that, because a lot of it came down to the necessary and proper clause in the Constitution, where they say that the federal government has the right to do everything that is necessary and proper in order to execute the duties that are assigned to them according to the Constitution. Right. Thomas Jefferson basically meant that if it's not necessary, then you can't do that, federal government. And then Alexander Hamilton kind of thought, well, it's necessary. Like, it's proper for me to do that act to carry out the goal of what is subscribed to the federal government. So he's like, hey, we have to collect taxes. We have to be able to establish trade route as a sovereign nation. And so in order to protect trade against smuggling, which had really grown up a lot, he starts building lighthouses with federal funds. And so he starts contracting with building lighthouses, and then he starts outfitting ships to go out and collect revenue. I think they were first called like the Revenue Marines or something like that.
The Revenue Marines.
Yeah.
That was their job, to collect taxes. That was the Coast Guard's first job.
Yeah, so the Coast Guard was out there basically protecting against smuggling, protecting against pirating, making sure that people paid their actual taxes in order to come in and start doing what they needed to do in order to establish those trade routes. And so the Coast Guard was established to kind of defend the coasts and to basically defend our taxes getting collected in those areas.
And on that same token of being a protean, founder of the New York Post. There's another wild card that Hamilton pulls out and does.
Yeah, and the New York Post was not exactly the same as it is established today. It's a little bit different from then, but the New York Evening Post is how it was styled at the beginning when Alexander Hamilton helped to create it with a team of other Federalists in New York. And they established this at the very beginning of the Jefferson presidency in 1801, I believe, which kind of goes to remind us that this does play a little bit more with the timeline, that Lin-Manuel Miranda is playing around here, putting all of these different ideas and all these different events of the timeline into one musical in order to give it a narrative flow, in order to give it the rise and the fall that we expect with our stories. But this New York Evening Post wouldn't be established until after the Adams administration, when Jefferson is in charge. And speaking of timelines being adjusted, that next line, ardently abusing his cabinet post. Remember, he had already stepped down from Washington's cabinet before the Adams administration ever started.
But he is going to get accused of abusing his power, as we've mentioned before, with the speculation. And then, of course, they're going to find out through the Reynolds pamphlet exactly what happened. Everyone's going to find out.
Yeah.
So there is some foreshadowing in the song here about what's about to happen in the songs.
Yeah, definitely. And it does allude to the ongoing investigation of what did Hamilton do. And even into the Jefferson presidency, he has his Secretary of the Treasury lead an investigation into what did Hamilton do that was wrong? What can we do to undo all of Hamilton's legacy in the Treasury Department? And he kind of comes back with, you know what, Hamilton, when it came to public funds, didn't do much wrong. He didn't do much that we can complain about, at least, and that we can undo, because everything is integrally connected to one another. If you take the bank away, everything falls as far as regulating taxes. If you take the taxes away, everything falls as to regarding our debt and our credit and everything that we need as a nation to prosper as a sovereign country. And so that ardently abusing his cabinet post is kind of an accusation thrown at Hamilton over and over again, even after he has left the cabinet.
Yeah. So then we get introduced to the Adams administration.
Yeah, I love that sound effect on the voice. It's so ominous almost. You realize that for Hamilton, there's that realization that he can't hide behind Washington anymore. The Adams administration opened it up to be open season towards Hamilton, even more so than it had been during the second term of Washington's administration.
So it's going to say Jefferson's the runner-up, which makes him the vice president. Remember, members of the Electoral College would cast 2 votes each, and the second highest vote gets to become vice president.
That's true. So it was a really contested battle back and forth here, where Hamilton did get accused of some machinations, some mischievous interactions here, where he was working behind the scenes because he didn't necessarily want Thomas Jefferson to be president, because, I mean, obviously he's in charge of the Democratic Republican Party, he's opposing the Federalists, he's opposing all of Hamilton's plans, but he also didn't think that Adams was the best choice for the presidency either. So even though Adams is the heir apparent as the the second in command, or the vice president under George Washington, at least, maybe not having the powers of a second in command because it was kind of a useless position for so long. But Hamilton looks at this and says, I don't really want Adams to be in charge. I definitely don't want Jefferson to be in charge. He starts putting forward these ideas into other Federalists' minds that we should put forward the South Carolinian Thomas Pinckney. We should put forward some votes to him so that we can make sure that Adams is the president, but Pinckney becomes the vice president. And through some of his maneuvering there, a lot of historians look back and think, well, maybe he really wanted Pinckney to be the president because he could have been a little more controlled than John Adams as that fiercely independent man who would not listen to Hamilton's instructions. But there was a lot of back and forth. Adams didn't know immediately that Hamilton had been involved in the political maneuvers and the structures that were kind of taking place in the voting there with the Electoral College, but Adams will eventually find out about Hamilton's betrayal there and will never, ever forgive Hamilton for opposing him and taking some of the votes away from him, so that when Jefferson becomes a vice president to John Adams, Adams only wins by 3 votes.
Yeah, it's not by a large margin.
Yeah, very, very small. Actually, I think it is the smallest margin of electoral votes that has ever elected our president.
Yeah. So Washington can't help you now. No, Mr. Nice President. You're no longer going to have the president on your side, Hamilton. And then it's going to say Adams fires Hamilton. But as we've already said, you can't fire someone who resigned, almost 2 years before you were elected as president.
Yeah.
So playing with the timeline there, showing you Hamilton getting pushed out. And I'm sure Adams probably would have fired him had he given the chance.
Yeah, and I think there are 2 ways to take this if we want to kind of give Lin-Manuel Miranda credit for it, because Adams did acknowledge eventually that since he kept on all of Washington's cabinet members to begin with, all of them were Hamilton's men.
Right.
All of them respected Hamilton a lot.
Yeah, you had the Secretary of War, James McHenry, and the Secretary of State, Thomas Pickering, which were both basically Hamilton's men. They were loyal to Hamilton, and Adams would fire both of them.
Yeah, and it was that's depicted in the miniseries pretty well, where they say, hey, you're not as good a president as Hamilton would be, or you're not doing as wise a thing as Hamilton would have advised. So Adams has a big fight with his own cabinet members. Jefferson warned him about that, saying, you shouldn't keep on these guys. They're Hamilton's men. Adams was like, we need to maintain the consistency of the regime as the administrations are changing. We need to make sure that there's some strength in these offices. So I'll keep on those members, even though they were Hamilton's guys. And so firing those men as his secretaries probably is, in effect, getting Hamilton out of being able to influence the political climate of his own administration. So that's one way to take it. Right. Another way could be that in the Adams administration, you see the creation of a standing army, where they appoint George Washington to be the nominal commander-in-chief of the army. But remember, George Washington is old. When he leaves presidency, he's not really able to go to war and lead strategically.
Which is an interesting thing to think about. When I saw it in the miniseries, I hadn't known much about the history of that.
Yeah.
And just to see that happen, I was like, oh, you realize you're getting a really old guy to lead your army, and he's like a retired president. This seems like a weird thing to do.
Yeah, but it was something that absolutely lent credibility to the ability to establish a standing army, which the Republicans were so opposed to. They did not appreciate the idea of the federal government being able to raise an army, especially in the time when France and Great Britain were at war with one another, and they kind of wanted to say, we're going to support France, right? We're going to support France. And they were kind of going back and forth. It looked like the Adams administration was trying to go for peace while increasing the size of the army, and so there's a little back and forth about what is John Adams really trying to accomplish here. And so in this idea of Adams firing Hamilton, Washington made it a condition of his hiring that he would serve as the general as long as he could appoint his own officers. And he appointed Hamilton to be the second in command, essentially the one in command, because Washington was not able to give all the day-to-day orders. And since Hamilton was in charge of this standing army, and then when Adams decided to downsize the army at the end of his administration, again, after creating it in the first place, he basically took Hamilton's control again out from underneath his feet.
Right. Here in the lyrics, privately calls him Creole bastard in his taunts, which if you've read Chernow or if you just know about the history in general, you'll know that that's only one of the few things that Adams called
Yeah.
Hamilton, and he said a lot of negative things about him, and generally alleged that Hamilton was devoid of knowledge of the American character or true appreciation of the Revolution's patriots, and could scarcely acquire the opinions, feelings, or principles of the American people.
Yeah, that's pretty harsh.
Yeah, Adams was kind of known for saying things like that about people, and I found in my research a Tumblr page that just collects what they call his sick burns. I'll probably put a link to that in the show notes. It was really fun to look through. And I like that Jefferson comes in here with that flat monotone, say what? Like, he's almost confused. He's like, I mean, I don't like him either, but that's going a little far.
Yeah. And when you have Thomas Jefferson questioning an attack on Hamilton, that says something, right?
Exactly.
So Hamilton, as the character who often one-ups everyone that attacks him, takes his response to the press.
Exactly.
Whereas Adams privately addressed the attacks against Hamilton, Hamilton publishes a large paper against the conduct and the character of President John Adams.
Yeah, he would actually publish a few pamphlets against John Adams while John Adams was still president and while he was still on the same team as him.
Yeah, the Federalists kind of attacking each other at that point, which was not a very good strategic political decision. But considering the fact that Hamilton was personally attacked, he didn't have that guiding star of Washington reining him in a little bit. He was just kind of free range, going after whatever attacks he had, and he kind of made a bad call attacking John Adams there.
Right.
It was kind of funny, like I saw a note on the Genius page at one point where they were kind of describing that pamphlet, and they said, or one of the pamphlets, and they said it's basically like 50 pages of lambasting how terrible John Adams is, and then about a few paragraphs of saying, but guys, you should still vote for him since he's a Federalist. Like, it was just silly. Like, he was the one that attacked him very viciously in the press. And of course, Hamilton wasn't the only person attacking the president in the press. Like,
right.
John Adams was also attacked by his friend Thomas Jefferson kind of subtly, and Jefferson was kind of paying some people to write articles against...
As we've talked about, Jefferson likes to do.
Yeah, that's a very conniving, sly move on Jefferson's
Exactly.
part. And then you get one of the greatest references. There are so many great references. It's hard to rank them. But here's another really wonderful reference to a previous musical starring John Adams.
Right, 1776.
Sit down, John, you fat mother bleep.
Yeah, so the first part's the reference, not so much the second part. I like that it comes right after Hamilton publishes his response, and that's Hamilton saying that. That's not a direct quote.
Yeah. The line in 1776, the musical, is basically kind of this like monotonous, not monotonous, just a repetitive tone that they do as they sing one of the opening songs of 1776, where John Adams has been standing in front of the Congress there. He's speaking for a really long time about how Congress needs to send an army to promote the welfare of Boston and the Massachusetts cause and things that are happening there. He says, we need to get involved here. And he's really long-winded. He's talking for a long time. And all the other legislators are there sitting and they're saying, hey, sit down, John. We get it. Sit down. Let's open a window. Open up a window. Like, you're talking for so long, we're getting exhausted. We're hot. And so they sing, sit down, John. Sit down, John. For God's sake, John, sit down. And it just goes throughout it all. And I mean, it was interesting to me that in the HBO miniseries, in the final episode, you actually have a line where Abigail looks at John when he's pacing back and forth and he's worried, and she says, for God's sake, John, sit down. And it just kind of goes off without a comment from him, but it made me kind of think of the musical as well. So it kind of looked like HBO kind of put that reference in when they were making that series as well.
Yeah, and this line is actually a remnant that was cut from a whole diss track aimed at John Adams that you can actually find on YouTube, and Lin-Manuel and a few of the others performing this. It's really fun to watch.
Oh, absolutely. We need to put a link to that in the show notes.
Yeah, we will definitely put a link to that.
Because there's a longer, drawn-out description of Hamilton's complaints against John Adams. And so there's a lot of accusations about how you're useless, you don't really do anything, and then you make really bad decisions. And he gives a shout-out to Abigail in the middle of those lines, and about how together they've both said bad things about Hamilton's reputation. So he kind of attacks them both in this long-winded rant about John Adams. And then it ends with that line of, sit down, John, you fat. And this is the only expletive that they actually bleep in the entire musical.
Yeah, which Lin-Manuel tweeted about and said, it's because it's funny, guys.
Yeah, it is funny.
And he doesn't actually just say the F-bomb there. He actually says F stick, which is weird because he put it up on his Twitter, an unbleeped version of it, and it just sounds real weird. It's like, that's not a real word. What?
He's just saying gibberish and funny things underneath it.
Yeah, and I really like that before he says it in the actual cast recording, you hear like this bomb sound, like this boop, as he's dropping the F-bomb.
Oh, yeah, that's a good reference. I heard that the lights themselves kind of flash like a bomb just went off.
Yeah, and he has this big book, and he's up on the second floor of the staging here, and he drops it, and it hits the ground with a bang.
Oh, that's awesome.
It's almost like a mic drop of the day. They didn't have mics. They had written
Yeah.
word.
Another little reference here that I don't think is intended necessarily, because Lin-Manuel Miranda was probably just going for the funny laugh line
Right.
with the bleep. But when Adams was president, he passed a series of bills known as the Alien and Seditions Act, where it was 4 bills basically put forward, that one of which allowed the federal government to cut down on anyone who was attacking the government, saying things that were not true against it.
Yeah.
And so if you were telling lies about the president or telling lies about the administration and basically threatening American security in any way that the president deemed fit, the president could basically exercise power against you and shut down your freedom of speech. And the Republicans, Thomas Jefferson, was very opposed to this, obviously, as the one who stands up for liberty, states' rights, the ability to challenge your government. And at this point in his time, he was still opposed to the federal government being a power grab, like Adams was basically doing with creating an army and then shutting down any opposition to him. So it's almost a kind of interesting reference to me to say that as Adams was president, he was accused of censoring free speech, and then here you have them bleeping out free speech.
Yeah,
and it's kind of interesting.
You know, Lin-Manuel's a genius. I'm going to go ahead and give it to him and say he probably did that on purpose. I always assume in his favor.
Oh, yeah.
Which, bringing up that point, though, I thought it was funny. I had briefly heard about someone being in prison because of that act, but then being reelected to their position in government while they were in prison for that. So I thought that was just really funny that you could be in prison for talking against the president, but be reelected in your position in the government.
Yeah, that's true. The Alien and Sedition Acts were basically leveled against only opponents of the Federalist Party.
Yeah.
Mainly because it was passed while John Adams as a Federalist was in power, and then most of them, 3/4 of them, were repealed or basically taken out or allowed to expire under the following Republican presidents. But there were 4 acts. One of them made it a lot harder for an immigrant to become an American citizen, making a longer term required for your immigration status to turn into citizen status. Then the other one allowed for the president to import any non-citizen that was deemed dangerous. So they basically called that the Alien Friends Act, that said that anyone that the president deems dangerous can be imprisoned or deported back to their homeland, which is really, that's a little scary, to be honest. The third one was that they could imprison or deport anyone that was from a hostile nation. So if we're at war with France and there are French people living here, the president could round them all up and send them back to France, which would be really scary for them, going back to a war-torn country, and it would be really scary for any French person who was living here. If you're on the side that the president doesn't like, you would be deemed an enemy. And then the last portion of it was the Sedition Act, basically talking about that free speech portion, where you said that if you say anything that's untrue about the federal government, they can prosecute you, and you could be guilty of treason for what you said against the government if it wasn't true. So of those 4 bills that compose the Alien and Sedition Acts that were passed under John Adams, only the Alien Enemies Act actually remained in effect past the Jefferson presidency and the Madison presidency, and is technically still in effect today because it was revisited during World War I, and it was rolled underneath this collection of rules for the United States Army and during times of war and everything. And so that bill was basically enacted by FDR when we were going to war with Japan, and we decided to imprison Japanese people in the United States, and they kind of stretched it out. And during World War II, there was an expansion of this rule where the government decided that they could apply this imprisonment and deportation to not just American immigrants or people that are immigrating to America, but also to citizens of America, where we were allowed as a government to capture anyone that they thought would be kind of loyal to their foreign country. So you see that Japanese American citizens were trapped in camps and imprisoned and really underwent some terrible, terrible moments. And so obviously, looking forward in history, we can see that these types of ideas, these bills that were placed there during the Adams administration, there's reason for people like Thomas Jefferson to oppose them. There's reason for that because we understand what it's like when the government wrongly imprisons people, wrongly treats people that should be free as if they're enemies, and does some really unethical and really questionably legal things. And so here, John Adams was in favor of passing these rules that kind of expanded the power of the federal government. Jefferson opposed it a lot, and that kind of takes us away from the lyrics a little bit, but it's a huge legacy that John Adams knew that would stay with his legacy forever.
Well, to take us off topic, maybe even more here, George Takei actually grew up in one of those internment camps. And
that's right.
He has this really sad story of him as a child looking out, saying the Pledge of Allegiance to a flag that's on the other side of a barbed wire fence and staring through that barbed wire fence at the flag and singing, freedom. But what's freedom when you're behind a barbed wire fence? You're talking about freedom, and it means nothing to you behind a barbed wire fence. And because of those stories that he's told over and over again, they actually worked on a musical that was on Broadway for a little bit. I think it closed early this year. It's called Allegiance, and I'm sure they're going to be doing more with that because it sounds fascinating. I'd really like to see it.
Yeah, I remember seeing the marquee back in December when I was in New York City on touring Broadway stuff, and I didn't actually visit it, and I regret that now. Looking back, I know a little bit of George Takei's story, and I've heard him speak about it, and it's very inspiring and moving and emotional to listen to his involvement there. And it is great that it is captured on Broadway. So if you ever are listening through the tracks to that musical, then perhaps you can think back to the Adams administration and how that actually springboarded us to have that revised version of the Aliens Enemies Act that basically allowed people like his family to be captured and brutally treated in an unfair way. And so the Adams administration was attacked on every side for this particular bill, for this set of bills that were put forward. Hamilton himself is one of those people leveling attacks against the Adams administration, not on the basis of the Alien and Sedition Act, because that wasn't necessarily something he voiced opposition on. He attacked Adams on a lot of other different things and on a lot of issues. So when Hamilton attacked the Adams administration, you have Aaron Burr coming onto the stage saying, Hamilton is out of control.
Right. And there's, a couple levels you could read into this. One, he's out of the government. He doesn't have as much control as he did there. Washington's gone,
That's true.
He doesn't have much control there. He's also kind of out of control himself. He's letting words fly. He's letting his attacks fly. And you can kind of look back to the Reynolds affair and say, yeah, he's kind of out of control.
Yeah, that makes sense. I like that dual meaning, so to speak.
Yeah. So you see Madison kind of celebrating. This is great. He's out of power, and he just destroyed President John Adams, the only significant member of his party.
This is the moment where the Republicans are really, really happy because the Federalists had two big pillar heads. Jefferson once called Hamilton a colossus, a host unto himself.
Exactly.
That he's about to reference in the next line. But you see that Hamilton and Adams were kind of the pillars of that Federalist Party. You saw a couple other people coming up through the Senate and coming up to really rally the Federalist position, but you won't really see any future Federalist influence outside of those founders. So you're going to see the creation of a few new political parties later on, so that even when John Adams' son, John Quincy Adams, is appointed president later on, he's appointed under a different political party.
Right.
So he resembles his father in a number of different ways, but he had to go a different route. The Federalists are kind of going out of power a little bit, and Adams and Hamilton were on the same team, kind of had that civil war in between them, and that made it to where the next few presidencies were Republican presidencies.
Exactly. Jefferson, like Robbie said, says that Hamilton's a host unto himself. That's a real quote. He said Hamilton is really a colossus to the anti-Republican party. Without numbers, he is a host within himself. Mm-hmm. And he says as long as he can hold a pen, he's a threat. And we've known that about Hamilton since the beginning of this whole musical.
He writes like he's running out of time. He's going to write his way out.
Yeah. So let's let him know what we know, which is where we'll pick up in the lyrics next time.
Yes, and then song We Know.
Right. So that's going to bring us to the end of the lyrics here, but now we get to dive into John Adams, the HBO miniseries.
Yeah, so we thought that it'd be really interesting. This is just an example of how the musical of Hamilton has springboarded us into learning more and more and trying to grab as much information as we can about this era of American history. It's really incredible the way that this is inspiring people to learn more about American history, learn more about world history when you get into the French Revolution, what's happening in Great Britain. And this is just one of those areas where it it's such a small moment in the musical that there are so many details here that we wanted to flesh out to say, what can we learn about the Adams administration that's not in this short song?
Exactly. This HBO miniseries is pretty highly acclaimed. It won a bunch of awards and stuff, and so it seemed like a good place to go. It's based off of the David McCulloch biography.
Right.
And so we thought we'd check it out.
Yeah, and I'm about a third of the way through that David McCulloch biography now, and I've been playing it nonstop for a while. It's
nonstop.
Nonstop. It's highly recommended. I think it's really good. I can't wait to have time to actually finish it and flesh it out because it's so good. But here, we don't have time to go do a beat-by-beat analysis of every single episode. We'd love to do that, and maybe we'll have a spin-off mini-series of another podcast one day where we can go through and analyze every single scene in every one of these episodes. There are only 7 episodes in the mini-series, but we don't have time to go through beat-by-beat for everything across the board.
Yeah, and there's only 7 episodes, but they're each over an hour long, so I mean that's a long bit of beat-by-beat going.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk a little bit. We will go episode by episode, and let's kind of talk a little bit about what episode 1 showed us.
Yeah, episode 1, Join or Die, that's covering 1770 to 1774. And you start off with the Boston Massacre, like right away. It just kind of opens up there. And you see John Adams basically becoming the representative to these soldiers who fired at citizens. And in the show, you see Samuel Adams kind of being against it, and the Sons of Liberty being like, no, why are you representing these soldiers? But in actual history, Samuel Adams was for it, and so were the Sons of Liberty. John Adams was a member of the Sons of Liberty. Yeah,
this episode kind of shows us the side of John Adams before he's ever become really political. He's just on the law side. He's standing up for the law. He says, I am for the law. There is no other side. Everyone deserves free representation. And so even when the bloody Boston Massacre occurs and Samuel Adams is leading his group and he promotes this pamphlet published by Paul Revere, he puts it forward and says, like, this is what happened. And you see the line of British soldiers firing into a group of young American unarmed citizens who are just sitting there opposing the British occupation. And the British soldiers have massacred these children, these young men, these people in the streets. And the trial goes to court, and it's the idea of Captain Preston and his men opposing the things that the Sons of Liberty were saying, well, they just fired on us. There was bloody massacre in the streets. They shouted, fire, fire, and they were trying to attack American citizens. And so everyone in Boston is riled up. They're so opposed to Great Britain's occupation, to the soldiers being there, and to the fact that these soldiers in particular have turned violent against their own colony. Right. And so you see that, and the moment is so volatile. And yet, John Adams, as a lawyer, is approached not to represent the colonists, but to represent the British soldiers. And he says, in a colony of Great Britain, we want to acknowledge that everyone here deserves a fair trial. Everyone here, because we are now endowed by our Creator with liberty and the right to live in a certain way, nobody should be without representation. So he takes the case to represent Captain Preston in one court case and Preston's soldiers in another court case.
Right, and the show shows them all together in one, and they all get off. In history, they did get off from the actual charges, but 2 of them were actually indicted under manslaughter. So I think they have their thumbs branded for that, and I'm not sure what all else goes into that. But here in the miniseries, he basically wins the case.
Yeah, and it's a really emotional, trying trial, and you see that there's that stereotypical British court scene where you have the tribunal up in front of you, the jury's been selected, and behind the bar are all of these, first of all, the defendant and the plaintiffs, but also all of the community is out there screaming.
Right, yeah, which seems so tense. They're all just yelling, and of course they're all against the British side, and they're just so angry that he would even take this case, and they're just like yelling at him, and it just seems really dangerous. I would not want to be there.
And historically, the courtroom itself was probably not that unorderly, but you get to see that in the miniseries, that's where they get to depict all of the colonial opposition to the British soldiers there. You get to see that there's so much excitement and anger about this trial, and so it's a fascinating thing. So you were right. You mentioned how Samuel Adams, who is the cousin, a distant cousin to John Adams, historically supported John Adams taking this case. Said, you're going to get a reputation for being a fair person. You're going to be seen as someone that is impartial, who is able to eventually then advance the colonists' cause for liberty and freedom because you are representing the British rights here as well as the colonial rights. And so in the miniseries, though, Sam Adams does kind of be that stereotypical caricature of the Sons of Liberty rioting against the British occupation. So he's seen as this person who's for violence, who's for aggression, who is only going to consider the angry voices against the British support there. And so he's painted as someone in the miniseries who is opposed to his cousin John Adams taking the case. But at the end of the episode, you do see that Samuel Adams looks to John Adams and says, since you have done this, you're in a politically advantageous moment where you can step forward and promote the Sons of Liberty now, and it would have a lot of weight because you're not someone that's just been a rabble-rouser. You're someone who can stand up for the rights of all people instead of just the colonists. And so John Adams in this trial has a really important role that he plays. And looking back on his whole life, an elder John Adams says, in a long history of law, this is one of the most important things he ever accomplished.
Right. I really like in this episode that they show that he takes his writings to Abigail to proofread for him, and that she's kind of there for him, advising him, and you can tell that he just appreciates her so much and trusts her and respects her and wants her opinion on things.
Yeah, the relationship with Abigail is perfect. I love it so much. There's a moment in correspondence historically that doesn't make it into the show, but I think it encapsulates a lot of things where when they're distant from one another, John Adams says that I'm longing for your presence because when you're with me, we're able to together have a quick discernment and a perfect candor. So they respect being perfectly truthful with one another and being able to quickly assess a situation, discern what is right and wrong or what situation needs to be analyzed in a certain way. So in their relationship, they do criticize each other back and forth. So if you just read one letter, you might see that John Adams is attacking Abigail for having a frumpy attitude about something, or Abigail is just attacking John for being so vain in a certain moment. But as you're listening and you're reading their correspondence, you see that they respect that in each other. They want to motivate each other to be better in their different spheres. And so they've agreed early on in their marriage to always have candor with one another and to always be loving and respectful to each other at the same time, to where Abigail respectfully calls him her tenderest husband for a lot of their correspondence. And John calls her his dearest friend and someone that he truly respects, someone whose information and her knowledge is always going to be behind him. Like John Adams at one point says that I could have been content going back to my father, Deacon John's farm, and living on that, but you could have never been content with a husband who is just out of the area of politics. Like you needed someone to be ambitious. And Abigail obviously pointed out, no, John, you're vain too. You have vanity too. You have ambition. You have pride. You're not someone that can just sit back and just watch everyone else succeed at something. You have to be out there. And together, they spurred each other on towards growth. They spurred each other on towards success. And Abigail in this series and in history is so strong. She's really a heroic woman that we should give all of the praise that exists.
Yeah. You mentioned that part where he actually tells Abigail in the miniseries here that he wishes he would have just gone back and been a shoemaker and a farmer. And he's like, then I probably would have never won you. And I actually really like that in this show that they take these quotes that were written and they'll put them in the dialogue that kind of show you what the thoughts and what they said were. So they're not things that maybe they actually said verbally, but they're things that we know that they wrote down, and then they use that as dialogue to express those thoughts and to, better build those characters for who they actually were in history. And I really like that. I thought it was a great way to do it.
Oh yeah, it's a really good way. There are moments when you have conversations between Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and John Adams all together in one spot, and they're all quoting their own papers that they've written about a certain topic, and those papers may or may not have ever been circulated into conversation with one another, but because they're such grand ideas, it's like the writers of the show said, hey, these three huge pillars are all in one place, having a friendship right in this one moment of history in France as ambassadors. Let's highlight some of their conflicts and some of their things by taking their papers, putting them into dialogue form, and letting them converse with one another. And that is a real strength of this miniseries.
Exactly. So at the end of the episode here, you're going to see that Adams is going to get some opportunities for advancement because of this trial and the things that he did here.
Yeah, in the miniseries, Attorney General Jonathan Sewell is one of the characters that I don't know that they actually say his whole name. They call him the Attorney General, and he says, like, the man and the office are the same. And it was really hard for me to figure out who he was for a while until I got into the David McCullough biography. And they highlight his character a lot more. And you see that he kind of puts his name forward to become a representative for King George III, to say, like, you'll be the king's man. You'll be given this office that will put you politically in a really important place. And, well, as long as King George stays in power, you know.
Right.
So he kind of struggles with that in the miniseries where he's saying, like, hey, I'd be the king's man. And he talks about how his own passion is being for the law. But in whose hands is the law exercised? Like, the law is exhibited through the power of the king. And so he talks about how there's this paradox. He's lying in bed with Abigail, and John is saying, I'm for the law, but the law is exercised by one king, and it's written by one king in his parliament, and is this really fair? Is this ethical? Is this right? And the king is the one who's supposed to be exercising law, but he can also give me a preferred treatment, which is not exactly impartial and unfair. So he's going back and forth, like, should I accept this? Should I not? I'm ambitious, and I know I'm vain, but I am trying to fight that within myself. He turns down that job, even though it's super tempting. Sons of Liberty come to him, say, hey, you're impartial now. You should take up our cause. He says, you know what, I'm not really interested in doing that right now. And so there's that big back and forth where you see the Sons of Liberty, headed by Samuel Adams, doing these really questionable things to British officers in this episode.
Right.
And John Adams is like, you can't do that. You can't be that aggressive.
Yeah, which in history, the Sons of Liberty might have done some of those things, but Samuel Adams himself was against that type of like mob attacking. And just a weird short note, in the show, they make the tar and feathering that they actually do to be a violent act. But in history, it wasn't necessarily so violent. It wasn't like a painful thing. The tar was different, and it was more humiliation. So the show kind of depicts it kind of weirdly, but to further the plot for sure.
Yeah, so it's not like a black tar that we have today. It was more like a sappy pine sap tar that they would have used for their ropes and things in Boston and all that. But yeah, the way they depicted that is much more violent and aggressive and painful in the episode. And that was a very hard scene to watch.
It was, yeah.
This is a good moment for us to add, you shouldn't watch this episode with your kids unless you're ready to fast forward through that portion of the thing, because there are a couple things. It's HBO, so you're going to see a couple moments where the guy that's tarred and feathered has a little bit of nudity when they strip him and pour tar over him. And then later when Nabby, their daughter, has breast cancer, they will expose her when they're doing surgery. And so be aware of that if you're watching this with your kids. But this is a really hard miniseries to watch when it comes to some of those brutal things that they depict in order to really show how harsh those times were.
Right. So the episode ends with Adams being elected to the First Continental Congress.
Yeah, so he's turned down a couple different opportunities for political advancement, but he accepts this one, to go to the Constitutional Convention, even though he acknowledges early on that this doesn't really have political authority because it's opposing the political authority of King George III.
Right.
But he goes down there. He's so concerned with defending the human rights that he sees as completely being violated by British people who are supposed to be their kinsmen, but they're treating the colonists as secondhand citizens. And he says, you can't do this because our rights are from something higher than the Parliament, something higher than the king. So that last speech that he gives in episode 1, where he's accepting the nomination to the First Continental Congress, such a good speech.
Right.
And almost all of it is verbatim from his writings at this point in his history. It's really good. And I love the moment where he gives this rousing speech. It's incredibly inspiring. He sits down in the church pew next to Abigail after delivering the speech. And then Abigail says, nice words, basically. And he says, but I am so full of self-doubt. And he starts like confiding in her, like, is what I said even right? Is this the right route to go? I'm questioning everything. And you see that Abigail's kind of that pillar of strength for him, that he's able to be vulnerable with her. He's able to say, I'm not as confident as I am in my writings. I'm questioning some of my own motivations here. I'm questioning whether history will view this with indulgence and whether it will be treated appropriately or whether this will be a huge blunder. So that does wrap up that episode where you see that he's getting in the carriage, saying goodbye to Abigail and his kids, and he's driving off to Philadelphia to join the Constitutional Convention, which is the theme of episode 2.
So, part 2, Independence, 1774 to 1776 here. And like you said, that's going to go over the Continental Congress here.
This episode actually has a lot of the moments that kind of remind me of the opening scenes of 1776 the musical, because you do see that here is the moment when John Adams is standing in front of the Congress giving these long-winded speeches, arguing for independence, arguing for sending troops to support the Boston troops that are being massacred, the troops that are being kind of quarantined where the harbors are being shut off and Boston's being shut down by the British, who are saying that they're just rabble-rousers, they're insubordinate, they're treasonous, and John Adams says, hey, we need to send them supplies. Really bad things are happening there. There's a war going on at Bunker Hill, and you see the moments where Abigail is there, and I think this is the episode where you get to see her kind of giving water to the troops. Is that this episode, or is it episode 3?
I don't remember. They kind of go together in my head. So it was either the second episode or episode 3 for sure.
Right. But all that to be said, this is the episode where John Adams interacts with a lot of the other revolutionaries of his time. So you'll see him having long conversations about political strategy with Benjamin Franklin, which is Benjamin Franklin's depicted really well.
Right.
He's intriguing in this.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see these people coming together on the screen here because, I mean, in your head, you see the writings and you're thinking these people are separate, but just to see them all together in one place, there's Franklin, there's Jefferson, there's Washington, and they're all just mingling together. And then when they have those meetings, those tense moments where they're arguing over these different things and the states aren't agreeing with each other, I mean, you can see that in the historical writings. You can see that through what they're saying, but it's different to see it being played out.
Oh, yeah, I completely agree with that. When you're sitting in a history class and you read, these are the points of the Federalist Party, and these are the points of the Republican Party, memorize those points. You don't really realize that what was it like when Hamilton and Jefferson were in the room talking with each other? How tense was that? When you say, these are all the things that John Adams stood for, these are all the things that Benjamin Franklin stood for, and they overlapped a lot, but there's that like Venn diagram where they overlapped in the middle, but they had differences of opinions on a lot of things. And so you get to see those played out a little bit here, and you realize that they have a much more personal element to their disagreements. It's not as simple as having memorized a different set of bullet points. You have to see that tension, that conflict that is building.
And you get to see that passion behind it. Like, we haven't really mentioned this yet, but Paul Giamatti does an amazing job here. And especially in these moments where he's got this anger rising in him, you can see him shaking, sitting as other people talk. And he's just like, no, that's not right. And I will not stand for it.
Yes.
And just his performance is beautiful.
Yeah, I can't applaud it enough. I think that I personally have had to repent of Paul Giamatti I've never really thought that he was a great actor. I thought he had some great roles here and there, had some subtle moments where he played something fine, but I didn't think he really could capture the extremes of what he does in this miniseries. And maybe it's just because I get to see him playing a youthful or more youthful John Adams, seeing him through his whole ambitious climb to power and then his retirement, and you see all of these stages of one person's life. And so, by the way, they age people incredibly well in this series.
They do.
So well. Like, if you look at... The
department was done really, really well. And then even in the performance, you get to see Adams himself, like, as he kind of stumbles around as an older man and he's working and he doesn't have as much strength. And you could see that Paul Giamatti really put that in there. He was really like, what's it like to be older? What's it like not to be able to lift this as well or do this as well?
Yeah, and so Paul Giamatti, beginning to end, makes this whole story arc for John Adams' life incredibly interesting, and he's so talented in every subtle way that he could be. And this is his role, that he became John Adams in my mind. I remember last December for Christmas, my mom bought me like a Scotch decanter with John Adams' face on it. So I, like, from that moment forward, I knew I was going to have to dive into John Adams' life a lot because it was neat. I haven't put Scotch in it yet, but we'll get to that point, I'm sure.
So 1776, as we mentioned in this episode, that's where they're going to be drafting the Declaration of Independence. So you kind of get to see that happen here on the screen. It's really interesting.
Yeah, you see that that Thomas Jefferson's given the right to draft it, and you get to see his hesitancy to any change that they want to make.
Right.
Benjamin Franklin sitting there going through line by line. He's like, let's rephrase this a little bit. Let's say inalienable rights instead of this other phrase you had. And Jefferson is just, you can see his
he's like fidgeting in the chair and just looking like, no.
Like, don't mess with my writings. You got it.
Like, that's not what every word was chosen very specifically. And Franklin's like, yeah, I know, but.
Yeah. It's great to see that interaction. So their convention here, it sets up the Declaration of Independence. That's kind of the result of their whole political side of things. In this episode, you also get to see Abigail's at home alone with the kids, and she is having to go through all of the stress of what is it like to have your husband away at the convention, away from you. And so there are a lot of moments where in this series, you'll see this get even heightened, and that's one of those themes, separation, when they are two halves of one coin. Like, John Adams and Abigail are so much meant for each other, and they are so much better when they are together. And here you get to see that it's the beginning of that theme of what happens when they're separate. Are they as successful apart as they are independently? And Abigail here has to deal with how to make the farm work when she's alone with her kids, and how to deal with smallpox.
Yeah, she gets those inoculations for herself and the kids, and that's painful to watch. You see the kids just like terrified of what's going on, and then they get sick. And just to watch how they even did the inoculation, I don't know how historically accurate it is or medically accurate it is, but just to watch the way that they were doing it is gross and unnerving.
Yeah, and I don't know all of the medical things about it as well, because it kind of gives you the heebie-jeebies to get into some of that. I come from a family, like my parents own a home healthcare agency, and I have a few, like my stepmom's a nurse, two of my sisters are nurses, and so I have that in my background. I let them handle the gross blood stuff, but in this episode, I do know that inoculation at that period of time took several days, and it was often something that would completely make you weak, exhaust you. You would be really worn out. You would get pretty sick from this to begin with. And Abigail here is making decisions for her family. She's stepping forward, and she is strong in the ability to be kind of progressive at that stage, to say, we're going to actively be inoculated against this, even when there are questions about whether this will work. This is the context where even the doctor looks at her and says, are you sure you should be making this decision without your husband around? And that condescending moment where Abigail just kind of steps forward. She's like, look, I know what's right here. I'm making that call.
Exactly. Yeah. And in history, of course, Adams actually already had his inoculation, so she would have known. They didn't really bring that up in the show, but they give a good character moment there for her to step forward and be like, I'm the master of the house right now. My husband's not even here.
Yeah.
I have to make these decisions for my family, for their safety. So that's going to take us to part 3. Don't Tread on Me. That's going to go from 1777 to 1781 here.
So this is the moment where John Adams has been appointed to be an ambassador to France. And he goes to a couple different areas in Europe as well while he's there. And when he gets there, he takes his son, John Quincy, to travel with him. Here you get to see the beginning of that favoring of John Quincy Adams over some of his other siblings. And you see that Charles is, in the episode itself, is left at home and is feeling like he doesn't have the love of his father, the attention of his father that John Quincy Adams has.
In history, Charles actually came along but got sick and had to go back home by himself afterwards.
Right. That's not depicted in the show, but yeah, there's that separation that's built between John and his son Charles, and that'll come into play incredibly in a couple of the next episodes.
Yeah. And here, seeing this depicted, I think it really reminds us that traveling overseas was not easy.
No.
It was a long, hard thing to do, and you were away from your family for a long time. It's not like today where I can go, I want to go to Japan. I'll just fly over there for a couple days and fly back.
Yeah.
And it's not like that. It's like, no, months, if not years even, depending on where you're going and what you're doing. So you get to see them on this ship, and then while they're on the ship, a British ship comes and attacks them, and you get to see that all go down as Adams has to help a man who was injured by a cannonball fire, and he's having his son stay below, and just how hard and crazy it can be to run into something like that. You're on open waters, there's war going on, and you see a warring ship. As you're just trying to travel, you're not trying to fight. You're just like, no, I just want to get over here. Leave us alone. I can't imagine how crazy that would have been.
Yeah, and that scene where someone is injured in that fight and they have to actually amputate his leg, and John Adams is there to participate. That's apparently a historical thing. Like, it took place a couple days after the attack, and
they kind of, push time together, as you have to in these depictions, as we've seen in our own musical that we've been going over.
Right, exactly. It's intense to see how naval warfare is handled at that period of time a little bit. It doesn't become overbearing about it. It just becomes a moment where you see, oh, this is real. This is dangerous. This is scary. And to actually amputate that leg with kind of a saw that's there and try to make a tourniquet and tranquilize it. Like, the way that this series depicts that era's modern medicine and surgery is really disquieting when I'm looking at it with modern eyes in 2016, and I'm looking back, I'm like, oh no, don't do it that way. That's so bad. That's so scary. But that's the way you did it. That's the way they had to do it. And there's really not a better way for them to have done that, especially on the open seas, when you can't just call in the experts to say, hey, I need a surgeon from New York City to fly down here to California and LA to take care of this thing, and I'm just going to put in an in-flight movie and then be at the place where you need to be in the next hour or whatever. And so it's a hard life, and they have to go through hard things, and it's intense.
Yeah, and I mean, I've mentioned it, I'll probably mention it again, but that's the importance of watching something like this, is that when you read it, you don't necessarily get that idea, but when you watch it, you go, yeah, life was different, and it's so hard for us to imagine in our modern days, but looking back, it's insane.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking of our own culture shock of looking at some of that, John Adams, when he arrives on French soil, he has his own culture shock there. He grew up in a congregational church. He becomes a Unitarian. He has this very rigid background. He was the son of a deacon in the church, and Abigail herself came from a pretty religious background. And they get there, and he's this duty-bound, honor-driven, ambitious person, and he encounters Benjamin Franklin, who's supposed to be his host. He's been the ambassador to France for a while, and Franklin's just posing for a sculpture to be done of him.
Right, yeah. Adam shows up, and he's ready to get down to work. He's like, let's go meet the king right now. Let's go. And he's like, where is everybody? And no one's here. And he finally finds Franklin. He's just sitting there. He's like, oh, come sit down. You ever been sculpted before? And he's like, we have work to do.
Yeah, and throughout this episode, you'll see even more of that, where Franklin's just kind of engaging the slow, laissez-faire attitude of the French court to say, you don't try to go bring up business at a dinner party. You don't try to get straight down to the brass tacks of what is being done and needs to be done. You just kind of go with the flow, embrace their Epicurean lifestyle. You just engage with their happiness and their sexual explorations and their entertainment-driven culture. And Franklin kind of just gives in to all of that. Yeah. And Adams is very uncomfortable.
Yeah, you can see him at the dinner parties that they have, just sitting there going, people are dying and decisions need to be made. And they're just asking questions about sex and about all these different things. And they're all dressed up, and it's this big banquet, and he's just so uncomfortable with it.
Yeah, there are some moments where the scene transitions in this episode really captured me, where you see that John Adams is at this decadent party where everyone's just painted up, everyone's wearing huge wigs, powdered wigs, lots of face paint. The makeup on the men and women both is very thick, and they're just talking about only the small talk things. They're not willing to engage with anything serious, and they're partying it up, and then you cut drastically to Abigail Adams at home in the colonies, in the dark, alone, struggling to survive. And that harshness of going from a moment where John Adams feels inept in the middle of this huge, beautiful party, and then Abigail Adams feeling inept alone in the middle of this harsh setting there. It's just a very different setting, but you see that together, the couple is feeling completely powerless without the other half as they're separated from one another in completely stark, different settings. And it's beautiful to see their love for one another grow and their reliance on one another. But here in the episode, you see that there's a distance growing that they both feel very heavily. John Adams in the episode talks about how he doesn't really want to write back to Abigail because he doesn't have any success to report. He doesn't want to send any letters back to her because he feels like a failure and he feels like he let her down. And Abigail gets super stressed. Can't you just send me one letter? Can't you just write me a little bit?
Yeah, and that's going to come up in the next episode too, where there's that frustration, like, why aren't you talking to me?
Yeah.
And you see in the episode, and in the next episode as well, that Adams is just feeling like a failure kind of here. And he's feeling like he's not making the progress he wants to make. Franklin's kind of turning against him because he's not willing to give in to the way that France does things here. And he goes over to the Dutch Republic to try to get some money for the revolution. And even they are like, you don't have the credit. We're not going to give you money. We support you, like, mentally, but not monetarily.
Yeah. So there's a lot of guilt that he's feeling because as soon as he arrives on French soil, he realizes, oh, we already negotiated a peace of sorts. We already got a treaty in place. And so John Adams feels like he didn't even need to show up because in the time that it took him to travel overseas, they had already negotiated something. So he goes into every negotiation with kind of a bully mentality where the French are like, hey, we already got this thing. We did your job for you. Congratulations. You should be happy. And John Adams is like, hey, I'm not happy with the size of the frigates that you're sending to us, the size of the Navy. Like, we can't actually win our independence from Great Britain with the size of the Navy you're supplying to us. You need to give us more support, France. You need to give us more help in the Revolutionary War, because you're just tacitly agreeing to it, but you're not really putting your money where your mouth is by sending help to help us a lot. And so he comes off as a bully who is unsuccessful, who eventually gets written up by Benjamin Franklin, who sends a letter to the Congress saying, hey, you should recall him because he's basically frustrating my plans here. He's frustrating everything. There's that tension building. There's that frustration driving everything. And so, it's understandable that he didn't want to write home about his own failures and about how terrible he was feeling, about how he actually gets sick at the end of this, where he's stressed out, he's overwhelmed, and he's negotiating with the Dutch Republic there to get money, and he just has a coughing fit, and they're like, Adams, are you well? And he's like, I'm fine. It's just the climate. It's all of that. But he's progressively getting worse and worse. He's getting sicker and sicker, and it's really, really sad to watch that. I did see an interview with one historian who was talking about the correspondence with Abigail and John Adams in history, and there was a moment in time when Abigail did start complaining about how he wasn't sending as many letters as she was writing to him, and historically, John had been writing back every single time. It's just that he had not been able to get the letters successfully to her in a timely manner. And so she would be writing like 9 in a row, and then she'd get a bunch all at once, just kind of delivered through less trustworthy means. I don't think that that's actually what's happening here in history. I think that was more when he was in Philadelphia and there was some correspondence there. I think that's what the historian was talking about. But you see that tension where two lovers, two married spouses are together and they feel that separation growing. And Adams himself feels that weight of failure and that weight of separation and that weight of being a disappointment to his country and a disappointment to his friends and a disappointment to his family and to his kids. And you see that John Quincy Adams is looking up at his dad and he sees that stress. Like, it's really interesting to look at how this kid is watching his father succeed and fail and drive himself. And we know that that guy is going to be the president of the United States one day.
Right. And the episode here actually ends with Adams being sick and his son being sent away as a diplomatic secretary for the Russian Empire, which takes us to part 4, reunion, 1781 to 1789. And in this episode, you're going to see the Revolutionary War come to an end and the Treaty of Paris.
Yeah, and just thematically, the namesake of this episode, reunion, you get to see John Adams and Abigail Adams back at one another's side.
Right. She comes over to stay with him.
That reunion scene is so well done, I think.
Yeah, I love the tension there when they first get together. She's angry at him. He doesn't know what to say, and they just kind of don't really talk at first.
Yeah. She gets out of the carriage and John Adams is not right there to greet her. And so she says, like, Mr. Adams or something. And then someone speaks to her in French and she's just highlighting how she's a fish out of water a little bit here.
Right.
And she is goes into the big palace-like area where he is staying because that's where they put up all of their ambassadors in this royal affair. And she goes in, finds her husband. They're silent as he kind of gives her a tour, walking through the whole house. And they get in, and you just see that tension is built, that they don't even hug or embrace for a while. After walking through all these beautifully decorated rooms, they go back to like a dark room where it's not really thrown together well. It's just kind of a storage area or whatever. And you just see them suddenly lose it, and they just embrace, and they start kissing each other, and they realize we have been missing each other so much.
Yeah.
We are here now. We can't be apart anymore like this. And Abigail says, hey, John, I came here with such harsh words for you, criticizing you for not writing enough, criticizing you for being away so long, criticizing you for everything here. But now that I'm here, I just need to be with you. I need to let you know how much I love you, I miss you, and they do have those harsh words for each other, the candor that is in their conversation, but you see in the depictions of the actors so much tension that's being released and so much emotion that has been pent up, like especially in Paul Giamatti's portrayal of John Adams here, you see that he is just losing it. he's been holding it in for so long. He's been a solo ambassador for so long. Even his fellow ambassadors have been betraying him. Ben Franklin acting against him. Thomas Jefferson not necessarily being on his side. He's there with Abigail Adams, and he knows, I suddenly have a partner again. I've needed this for so long, and he breaks down. And that relationship, my goodness, so beautiful.
So in the show, it's going to take us to him being assigned to be the ambassador to Great Britain. And like we mentioned in the lyrics, this is where he's going to have to come before King George III.
Yeah, so he gets those special instructions, like, you may want to dress a little less American. You may want to dress a little bit better. Which, we didn't mention it before, but I loved how in the second episode, Benjamin Franklin was actually wearing like a coonskin cap. Like historically, he was wearing the most rugged American apparel that he possibly could, because apparently that helped him in his negotiations, because the French loved to laugh at Americans who are so rugged, and that like just made things lighter and laissez-faire. And John Adams was all business. He was all about just making sure we present the right royal presentation to everybody around. And so he gets schooled in what to wear, how to act when he approaches the king. You're going to have to bow 3 times, once on entering the room, once on halfway, and then you finally can approach and make your statements to them once they give you permission. And so the king's just standing there next to his throne, not really saying anything for a while. But you do get to hear some of these things that were written in their correspondence back and forth. Yeah. These really moving quotes about how John Adams is honored to be standing there, hoping that he can redeem the relationship that has been lost, saying that I stand here representing an independent state, hoping that I can actually, through my efforts as an ambassador, redeem our relationship that has been severed in so many different ways. But I want to be able to embrace you as a friend and an ally now. And the king looks at him and he says, I was the last to embrace independence, but I will be the first to embrace a friendship with you. Like, I'm glad that you're here. I appreciate that this correspondence is happening. And you get to see a teary-eyed King George a little bit, where it's really stirring.
Yeah, the meeting, while it's awkward and it's tense, it doesn't go horribly for Adams. But when he leaves it, he sees in the papers that he's basically being trashed by the people. And you get that scene where him and Abigail are sitting there going, why are we here?
Yeah, it's really interesting to see the response of the British people, especially there. I mean, he's visiting as an ambassador from a recently hostile power.
Yeah.
Remember, the Revolutionary War was fresh here. This is just a few years later. Everyone who is able to be involved in politics remembers that era. Everybody knows what has happened and is very keen on what is happening. And so you see these huge crowds assembled to throw hatred to what John Adams is doing and who they are, and you see these writings about them that are really hostile and terrible, and it's really disappointing for him. One of those scene transitions that I liked, though, is that in this episode, you have that scene of him kind of going through not successful, and then immediately they transition to him coming back to the United States, and he's on the ship, and he steps off, and there's a huge crowd assembled to celebrate him.
Yeah, everyone's super excited that he's back there.
Yeah, they're happy that John Adams, this guy that has been away for so long, is coming home. You have that moment where you almost imagine them singing, John Adams is coming home. Like, where he is now being greeted by a crowd that likes him. And he's just said, like, I don't need approval from the audience. I don't need approval from the crowds. I know that I'm doing what I need to do. I know that I'm doing what's right. Then he gets approval from the crowd, and you see a smile grow on his face. You see that moment where he's getting that pride growing, like, yeah, I'm finally being recognized. This is good. And the saddest moment of that scene is when he comes down after being praised and exalted for what he's done, being welcomed back home. He sees his grown-up children.
Yeah, who he hardly recognizes. It's performed very well. He kind of stares at them, and he's like, and then they have to say who they are, and he's like, oh, right, I know.
Yeah.
But it's like that tension of, I don't know who you are anymore. I've been gone so long.
Having a grandmother who's dealing with really advanced Alzheimer's and dementia, it's hard when you're going through that stage where you're looking at someone that should love you and should embrace you, that is a parent figure or even a grandparent figure who looks at you, and you can see in their eyes that they know they should know you, but they can't quite place it. And so I imagine myself in the role of these children, and John Quincy kind of has to look at his father and say, well, let me introduce you. You recognize Charles, right? Yeah. And Nabby, Abigail, like, you recognize your kids, right? And he's like, yeah, totally. And he obviously didn't. And that's just emphasizing the fact of how long he's been away. That's rough.
So just to go through this last part kind of fast, there's a lot going on here, but you're going to see the election of the President of the United States and that John Adams is going to become vice president. And he initially is disappointed. He kind of wants to reject it. He's like, well, the people aren't going to vote for me. This is a sham. I'm out.
Yeah, and he understands that George Washington is the natural choice for president,
right?
But he doesn't appreciate how few of the electoral votes he received.
Exactly.
So he thinks that he should have had more showing, and it's just an insult to his character that he didn't get enough. He's an ambitious person. He understands, and like if you read his journals and his writings, he talks about vanity as his own failure. It's his biggest fault. He goes into this, and he knows, I am super uninterested in accepting this because I feel like it's an insult. And to begin with, he almost didn't accept the nominations for all these different things when he was put forward. They said, hey, your name is being considered for senator, for governor, for all these different positions, for vice president. Some people are even considering you for president. And he says, I'm not interested. And Abigail says, you can't accept anything less than vice president because she believes in him. She's ambitious herself. Yeah. And so when the vote is finally held, he almost doesn't take that role of vice president even because of the insult to his character. And it's interesting. You see all of those political games being played, and he feels like the vice president role is beneath him, but Abigail influences him to accept it. And this episode ends with one of the really stirring, emotional, gripping moments when President George Washington is swearing into office.
Yeah.
So the person swearing him in is holding the Bible, and he's shouting to a large crowd of assembled people, repeat after me, I, President George Washington, and then he repeats, but he repeats it in a whisper, just to emphasize how solemn this moment is, how he's taking it seriously. He's not going to make this about showing off to the people. He's not going to make this about a display for everyone to see. George Washington is taking it seriously. He knows how somber this moment is, and he whispers his repetition, I, President George Washington. It's almost like everyone there is leaning in, trying to hear, and it's so hard. But you see John Adams behind him as the vice president going into this moment. It's a very monumental time for the United States, and it takes us into episode 5, which is devoted to the presidency of George Washington and the vice presidency of John Adams.
Right. Unite or Die, 1788 to 1797. And this episode is really going to focus on John Adams' frustration with being vice president, how he feels like there's no power in it. You can't actually do anything, which I think, brought up in another episode, his quote on how the vice president is just this ridiculous role. And you actually get to see him not invited to that inner circle of Washington's. And you get to see that he's also not allowed to be in the room where it happens.
Yes.
Because you get to see Jefferson and our man Hamilton here and their strained relationship as well.
Yeah, this is the episode where Hamilton fans should get really excited because our man takes the stage and you see John Adams' life actively conflicts with Alexander Hamilton's life and his ambitions there, where Hamilton gets to be in the room where it happens and Washington dismisses his vice president from all cabinet meetings. And It's super tense. You get to see in this, one of my favorite scenes is around the dinner table where George Washington is hosting a meal and Thomas Jefferson's just come back from France. They welcomed him home and they're having an engagement on political issues. Hamilton promotes how we need to have a strong central government. We need to have a bank. We need to have a system where we assume state debts. And Thomas Jefferson's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. I feel like we just fought a war against strong government. We need to make sure we are not violating state rights. And you see that whole Jeffersonian, Hamiltonian philosophy compete with one another. And John Adams tries to get his 2 cents in, edgewise, into that conversation where he kind of just comes off as a nothing moderate to me, where he's like, well, yeah, Hamilton, we definitely need to do that. But, I mean, without Jefferson violating state rights. Everyone kind of looks at him like, thanks, John.
Yeah.
Thanks for your contribution.
Big contribution there.
Yeah, and so Washington kind of stands up and he dismisses him and makes this reference to how John Adams was kind of wanting a large, exalted office of presidency. He wanted them to be introduced as His Excellency or His Highness or Your Majesty, the President. And George Washington just wanted something simple like Mr. President. And so when John Adams is leaving the room, he says, Mr. President. John Adams is walking out, and George Washington says, yes, Mr. President, and nothing more. So there's that harsh tension where no one in the room is really on Adams's side, save maybe his friend Thomas Jefferson that he made in France, and they're kind of on the same page for a little while, and they kind of say their goodbyes appropriately and respectfully, and John Adams leaves, and the cabinet decides what's going to happen. And that's the way it happens throughout a lot of this episode, where John Adams is the outsider and Hamilton, Jefferson, and Washington get to duke it out in their cabinet meetings alone.
Yeah, and you're going to see the Jay Treaty, which we mentioned with Britain, and Adams having to ratify it and get the Senate out of deadlock. Not really historical there. They didn't really need his vote. It wasn't required.
Remember, the vice president only gets to vote in the Senate if they actually have a tied vote. He can be the tiebreaker. But you're right, the Jay Treaty passed without a tie vote. It was hotly debated, and there were pieces of it that were kept from the public for a long time because it was so crazy on certain things that people thought, we don't really need to be public about this or we'll incite riots in the streets because of how bad this is. But yeah, since you don't get to see all of the American response, you get to see in the Senate that everyone there is tense. Everyone's on the edge of their seats saying, we can't support this. And John Adams just shuts it down, says, hey, I don't get to do very much. I'm going to actively cast my vote, and I'm going to put forward that the Jay Treaty is passed.
And this episode is going to conclude with Washington having stepped down and the next vote going in place and the Adams administration.
Yes, so this is the part that overlaps with our song. We were talking from Hamilton, the Adams administration, where Adams and Jefferson have, they're the two biggest candidates for presidency after George Washington, and Adams wins by that 3-vote margin.
Right.
You remember, he was almost going to turn down being the vice president to George Washington because he didn't get enough electoral votes. Now he just wins the presidency by 3 votes. He feels incredibly insulted there too.
Yeah. So the next episode, part 6, Unnecessary Wars, 1798 to 1802, is going to cover the Adams presidency.
Yeah, so in this, you see that the big things they kind of highlight here are the cementing of the Hamilton-led Federalist Party and the Jefferson-led Republicans. You're going to see the creation and the signing of the Alien and Sedition Acts that we talked about earlier in this episode, where you see that Abigail has to counsel him through his stress and his tension, saying, hey, the country is finally on your side. Just sign this. Go through that. There's some interesting things there. And with the creation of the Army being the final big thing that John Adams gets to have a lot of heat for, that he's going to try to be maintaining peace with the French people and peace with the British Empire, and they're at war with each other right now, and he says, we're kind of engaged in a quasi-war with France, with a naval battle, so to speak. We need to be prepared in order to address whatever might come over here. So he creates that army, sets George Washington up as head, Hamilton as the de facto leader, and that scene in the miniseries is really, really cool. You get to see Hamilton and Adams having active words against one another, and it's really neat to see that conflict there. But yeah, there are a lot of issues in the Adams presidency that get to be brought up, and so the political side of it in itself is a stirring episode.
Yeah, there's a lot politically going on in this episode. And I mean, obviously you see the Federalists and the Republicans, and Adams is kind of stuck in between, upset at both. But there's this big personal thing going on as well. You get to see what's going on with his son, Charles, who is in debt and addicted to things, and he's struggling. And you see Adams go meet with him, and there's this big fight basically where he disowns him, and it's just big emotional, tumultuous moment where you see a father disowning his son and the struggle of a family with a son whose life is falling apart, basically.
Yeah, and this leads up to the eventual loss of a son to alcoholism and his death. It's so hard to see how both parents, Abigail and John, deal with the death of their son slightly differently. They both are very emotionally affected, but Abigail says, he was the delight of my eye. And John says, I'm not going to speak of him. He was kind of a blight on our reputation for a while.
Right.
Then Abigail confronts him with those things. I raised him. We loved him. We shouldn't ignore that fact that he was our kid. And you see that it is so heartbreaking personally. The things that happen in this episode are so sad. And yeah, it is devastating for their family. This episode leads up to, with all the political drama that's played out in the presidency and all of the personal family drama that's played out, at the end of the episode, you see the presidential election of 1800.
Right. So you're going to see that Thomas Jefferson is actually going to become the president here. And the runner-up, Aaron Burr, is going to become the vice president. That's something we'll get to in the musical a little bit later. But
in Hamilton the musical, they have a whole period devoted to this. And so we won't dissect this all right now. We'll save that for our upcoming episodes where we have the whole election of 1800. But just know that in this episode, they do a pretty good job of depicting some of the political intrigue that's happening here. They don't dive into Aaron Burr as much as we want to going forward, but you do see that Vice President Thomas Jefferson is running against John Adams, and while Adams won by a small little bitty margin to be president to begin with, Jefferson now wins by a small margin after a long-winded, long deadlocked Senate. It took a really long time for the Senate to finally break this tie vote between Jefferson and Burr to decide who would be the next president after John Adams.
Right.
And so, remember, it was pretty much destined that the person following George Washington would not have a very successful presidency. Here we see that John Adams leaves office without having been a terribly successful president, but having still been an incredibly important one. And the things that happened in his presidency were super, super important.
And so Adams retires, basically. You see in part 7, the final episode here, Peacefield, 1803 to 1826, that he's back home finally. He gets to spend time with his family.
Yeah, so one thing we didn't mention is that Adams was the first one to actually live in the executive mansion, becomes the White House. It was under construction. It was not very elaborate at the time. Abigail was complaining about having to live there in the really worn down situation. Yeah, so they've left that and they've gone back to their family home. And let me just say, this final episode, episode 7, heartbreaking.
Yeah, grab your box of tissues before watching this episode, because I don't cry much and I sobbed during this episode.
And I do cry. And I cried 4 times in this. Like, you get to see that the politics is played down very low. There's a little bit of political stuff that's happening as he interacts with what happens during the Jefferson presidency and the Madison presidency and the articles that are written about John Adams. And there are some things politically that happen. But the meat of this 7th episode is all personal.
Yeah, you're going to see his daughter, Nabby, has breast cancer, and you're going to see the doctor come in and have to remove that breast. I think I already mentioned it, that's so hard to watch.
Yeah, that's the first time I cried, where their daughter, Nabby, is succumbed to breast cancer, and you see her going under the knife, and you think that it might work out, but eventually it comes back, and it's worse, and she dies.
Yeah, she even gives up on it. She's just like, I know nothing they do is going to work. I'm ready. I'm ready for this. And just to see that heartbreak of a family going through tragedy like that together.
Yeah, and she has already had a fairly tragic storyline. We didn't get to talk yet about her marriage to Colonel Smith.
Right. Yeah. So in the show here, you see John Adams kind of denying Colonel Smith a bunch of opportunities, and there's kind of this tension between the father-in-law and the son-in-law there. But in history, that wasn't really there. He was kind of a mess up. He made a bunch of poor decisions, but Adams kind of helped him out. And he eventually would go west with his family until Nabby here gets cancer and she would come back home. And actually, Colonel Smith would devote a lot of his time to researching this and trying to find out how he can help his wife get over this cancer.
Yeah, so historically, he wasn't quite as much of a deadbeat as they present him in this particular miniseries, but he was kind of a failure in a lot of his ventures. There was that tension with the family. When he actually was presented there to be a spouse for Nabby to marry into the family, the first indicator I had that it was not necessarily a good match to begin with is because Colonel Smith was Moriarty from Sherlock.
Right, exactly. First thought was like, oh, you're a bad guy.
Yeah, so Andrew Scott, the actor who plays Moriarty in Sherlock on BBC's network, is playing Colonel Smith here as the husband for Nabby, and so he plays crooked characters at times. I don't know.
Right.
I've not looked through his whole IMDb article or anything, but my interaction with him is as this arch villain to Sherlock and the schemes that he plays and how much he does in that series. So I was already on the edge of my seat wondering, like, can this guy be trusted? And when Nabby looks at her father and says, hey, on my deathbed, the one thing I wish of you, the one request I will make is that you do not bear ill will to my husband. And you see the tension in his face. This is a guy who is always going to say what he believes, and he believes candor is a virtue. You see Paul Giamatti does a beautiful job of capturing this heart-wrenching scene where he just goes forward, kisses her, sits down, and then when he finally resumes his relationship with his son-in-law there, he doesn't say anything bad to him. It's moving, it's stirring. The next time that I actually cried in this episode was when Abigail is lost.
Yeah, John Adams loses his wife in this. And I mean, you know what's going to happen if you know history. And so you see it coming, but nothing can prepare you for the performance here. And to see Paul Giamatti in this role, Adams holding his wife and just see her slipping in and out of consciousness, and to see her saying, I'm going, I know I'm going. And he's like, no, stay with me. And then as she goes, he says, goodbye, my friend. And at that moment, I started sobbing uncontrollably. Yes. And I had to like hold my face. As a married man, you can't help but put yourself in that shoes, knowing that one day you could have to say goodbye like that. And just that feeling of intensity in my heart was too much to bear. I had to pause the episode before continuing.
After the loss of Abigail, John Adams, you get to see the rest of his life. He lives quite a bit longer, and he lives to see his son, John Quincy, become president.
Yeah, what a proud moment.
Yeah, it's a super proud moment. I think that the third moment that I actually cried in this was when, and this is less of an emotional impact in the series, but maybe just because I was already emotionally weak and vulnerable and sensitive to everything happening. The fact that John Adams initiated correspondence again with Thomas Jefferson right after losing his wife there was a moving moment. The redemption of their friendship. They were friends in France. They became political enemies. It was known at this time to John Adams that Thomas Jefferson had maneuvered some things against him during his presidency to make things not work as well for him. Even as his vice president, he was working against the administration. And you see that forgiveness, where you see that friendship being built, where it's like John Adams at his weakest moment, grabbing his oldest friend here, saying, hey, I just lost my partner, my beloved friend, and I need someone here. And so he reaches out to Thomas Jefferson, and there's that renewal of friendship, that redemption of their friendship, and they correspond for the rest of their lives together. Historically, it wasn't his wife's death that made them get back together.
Right. They actually started talking in 1812, quite a while before her death.
Yeah, but it's a stirring moment, the way they arranged this in the episode, to see that the correspondence between Adams and Jefferson is really, really neat historically to look through. I've obviously not looked through it all myself. I'm not a professional historian, but I've seen professional historians talk about this, and they talk about how their letters back and forth, Adams would actually write much more frequently than Jefferson would, but Jefferson would always write back long letters and reply, and Jefferson would say, I don't understand how you're writing so much. You're writing all of these things. And Adams replied back with the greatest of compliments, saying, listen, I'm actually ignoring all of my letters that I have to write to other people in the country and across the seas because I want to write to the one person in the United States who knows enough to actually teach me something. And so they have a friendship where they look at each other. They're often talking about the books they're reading. They're talking about how they read nonstop. John Adams actually had a standing order at a bookstore in London to where he said, hey, send me any book of worthy repute that you receive that gets published on the topics of politics and law. Just send it to me immediately. I'll pay for it because I want to be in the know. I want to know everything. Thomas Jefferson looked back at him, and we know what a reader Thomas Jefferson was. We know that his library was so huge, it became the foundation of what was the Library of Congress, essentially.
Exactly.
And John Adams still is the person that Thomas Jefferson looked at, and he said, I don't understand how you're reading so much. Right. You're reading so many things. You are studying these, and you understand them. You're comprehending them. You're writing about them to me. And so they would share what they're writing, what they're reading back and forth with each other. And that correspondence between friends was incredibly interesting and really monumental. And it would have been an interesting what-if scenario if that friendship between Adams and Jefferson had not been wounded so much during the presidency of John Adams. Because if they actually went into that whole administration as friends and as people who wanted to accomplish something together respectfully, maybe they wouldn't have been actively antagonistic as at least as much as they were towards one another. And so that correspondence is really, really neat to look at. You get to see in this final episode of the series that they grow to be two of the oldest members, longest living members of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. They were kind of looked at as the North and South Pole of the Revolution, saying that John Adams stood up for this side of things as the Federalist camp, and Thomas Jefferson stood up for this side of things as in the Independence side of things. And together they created the atmosphere where the Revolution could thrive. So since they'd lived the longest, their contemporaries were looking at them respectfully as people who their lives should be celebrated. They should be appreciated. And so they lived to the point where they both die on the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration.
Yeah, and actually in this episode, they go back a little bit. They have John Adams come in and look at John Trumbull's painting of the Declaration of Independence. And I really like his comment where he's like, all these people were not in one room. This isn't one that was like historically inaccurate, which is kind of a funny comment on adaptation of historical events. Like we see in the musical and like we see in this miniseries, sometimes they put people in the room where they weren't in that room, or they have conversations that they didn't really have to, show things that did happen in history, but in a different way. They like tell you more clearly what happened. And so it's almost like his comment on that. It's like, you can't do that. That's historically inaccurate.
Right. Adams was very committed to making sure that the facts of the Revolution were told, the facts of the stories were there. And so when he looks at that picture historically, I don't think he really had that interaction with Trumbull himself,
No.
like actively criticizing and attacking his work very gracelessly.
Yeah.
I think there was some correspondence I heard people talking about on a interview where I think it was with David McCullough, where they talked about how he wasn't a fan of this actual painting because of those inaccuracies, because there was never a moment when all of the signers of the Declaration were in one room together,
right,
signing this all at once. Like they were at war. People were coming and going in and out of the city all at the same time. So they tried to like pass the document around as best they could to whoever could come in. When you could get some time, go sign your name to it. Yeah, so it was just a really stressful period in American history, and they painted it as if there were just a bunch of people who just had time to sit there, sitting in their chairs to sign this paper. And he kind of called it a shin piece or something, or like a leg piece, because it shows a lot of people sitting and it just shows their shins and their legs. But so it's funny to show that even in his old age, Adams never lost his fierce independence. He is a fiercely independent person who, when speaking to Jefferson, says at one point, I am a party of one. I'm not here to be a partisan Federalist. I'm a party of one, standing up for what I believe to be true and ethical. So I'm going to be here as a pillar of independence, independently criticizing the Declaration of Independence painting that's there. I thought that scene was really, really neat. So the final time that brought me to tears in this episode was obviously the death of our protagonist.
Right. And I really like how they kind of intercut it with the death of Thomas Jefferson. You kind of have this back and forth of the moments, and even that they're mentioning each other kind of. And you see that actually Jefferson has Sally sitting next to him holding his hand, and she's weeping. And so that's really interesting to me from what we've talked about with Jefferson.
Oh, yeah. That's he's surrounded by his slaves who are attending to him, and Sally Hemings is right there kind of affectionately looking to him, and you see that his slaves start weeping over him. And I like that they depicted the moment where Thomas Jefferson, the night before, kind of says, hey, is it almost the 4th? Tomorrow's the 4th, right?
Right. He
refuses medicine or something, some type of special treatment. And he's like, through the power of my own will, I will survive to see another 4th of July.
Right.
He makes it to that day. And it's a wonderful mystery of history where you get to see that these two pillars of the Declaration of Independence, two pillars of the country's founding, live to the same day and die on the 4th of July.
The 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson's 83 when he dies, and Adams is 90, but they die within hours of each other.
Yeah, and Adams' final words are, Jefferson survives. And he's factually inaccurate at the time, but because of what he knew, correspondence was not immediate. He didn't get Twitter notifications to show that Jefferson had just passed away. He was laying there on his deathbed, and his final words were, Jefferson survives. He's a survivor. He's the one that can be around to tell the story eventually. But that's a really sad moment. The thing that really brought me to tears, though, was when Adams was laying there on his deathbed, what everyone knew to be his deathbed, and he starts speaking in slightly incoherent sentences.
Yeah.
He starts kind of losing it for a moment. This guy who's been sharp and quick-witted through his whole life is starting to lose it a little bit, and he calls out for Abigail.
Yeah.
Abigail, who has been dead for a while. He needs her at his side, and he calls for her, and she's not there.
Yeah. And I kind of saw that differently. And when he starts calling for her, I imagine, like you said, that he's calling for her, but toward the end, it sounds more comforted. He says, Abigail.
Yes.
As if he's seeing her face to face. And that's like the last thing that you really get to see of him. And then, of course, the miniseries ends with them walking through, like this dreamlike garden together and conversing. And it's so beautiful.
Yes.
And I mean, I got goosebumps with you talking about it. It's such a great moment in the miniseries.
Yes, I love that. And I do think that there's that. Like, he's calling out for her first, and then like he's comforted by her presence.
Yeah.
So this series has given me a new appreciation for John Adams and for the Adams administration and for all that it has meant in American history. I look back on the Revolutionary era, and John Adams, before starting to research into this, he didn't have a huge place in my mind.
No, not at all.
He was kind of just that person who followed up George Washington and then filled the gap between Thomas Jefferson taking charge. And it was important to me that I learned more about John Adams.
Yeah, even when we did our Jefferson episode and we kind of covered his whole life, we even touched on a lot of the things that happened here. We didn't dive too deeply into Adams. I think it's because we knew this was coming, but it was really interesting to see that side of the history and then to come back and kind of explore that same time again, but from a different perspective, and to see this other person's life who had a big hand in the events.
Right. So, big takeaway, what is the most striking element of this miniseries and about John Adams to you, Vinton?
For me, it was just his passion for justice and seeing that things were done. And he wasn't willing to back down or compromise on things. He wanted to see justice and freedom. And he might have been wrong on certain points, but he had this idea of what freedom was, this idea of what justice meant, and he wasn't willing to back down from it.
Yeah, I love that. That's exactly my answer too. I think that he was fiercely loyal to the idea of justice.
Right.
He's someone who stood up for the rights of man and the rights of mankind, and he saw those rights as completely outside of what government gives you. He saw these rights as things that the government has to maintain because they come from a higher law. People are free and independent, and government should respect that. And the way he governs, the way he leads, the way he interacts with diplomats was interesting because you can see that he's passionate about justice being served, but he's also not exactly full of tact. Yeah. He's someone that is very passionate, and his passion sometimes drives him to the point of being aggressive. It's just kind of rough around the edges sometimes. He's just harsh, and he doesn't feel like he needs to rein in his tongue at times, and so he just says, "You are an absolute fool, Alexander Hamilton." Like, I've never heard someone speak such foolishness in my life. Either you're a fool or I am, and surely I'm not a fool, like, is the implication. Right. He doesn't compromise. He's an uncompromising person, but he's someone that doesn't compromise because he is so passionate about justice being seen, fairness being delivered, and all the way back to that trial in the first episode of him representing the people that are seen as the aggressors. He wants every person to have a fair representation and a fair opportunity in this new country that we call the United States of America. And so that passion, that stubbornness is something I relate to. That's something that I think is just wonderful, and I think you worded it well with your articulation of what we should respect in John Adams.
Yeah. And if there's one other thing that I walk away with, one other major thing here, it's the same thing that I think a lot of us walked away from with Hamilton, the musical itself. And it's that the founding mothers are very important and influential. Abigail is a rock here, and she is awesome. And I loved getting to know that character, that person in history, really, through her portrayal here.
Yes. Abigail, beast of a woman.
Right.
She is wonderful.
We've said it once. We'll say it again. Founding mothers, go read them. Go read about them.
Yeah, and if you're out there and you are so inspired, write musicals about them.
Yes,
because I would.
Many more musicals.
I will buy those tickets. I want to be there. So I think that will bring us to the end of our episode on the Adams administration.
Right.
Ironically, it's one of the shortest songs on the cast album, and yet we've made this episode into a pretty long one because we wanted to dive into all the miniseries so we could kind of just wrestle with who is this guy, John Adams, and what was his administration like. And I hope that you've appreciated learning from us and from the episodes and from your own research and history. If you watched this miniseries with us and we're just separate and you've seen it on your own, we encourage you to tweet at us or send us an email at contact@graphocast.com or at graphocast on Twitter. Tweet at us and let us know what you think are the greatest takeaways from the person of John Adams. Tell us what you think this mini-series is really really driving to? Like, what are the things we can take away and learn from his legacy and what that really should mean in American history?
Yeah, we'd really love to hear your thoughts and talk with you about that. Remember, you can also leave comments on the webpage, graphocast.com, for each post for the episode.
Yeah, and if you want to complain about anything I slipped up and said specifically, you can hit me up personally at Alpha Knight.
And I'm at Flesh Eater. I almost wanted to give you a different Twitter handle if you were going to complain about things.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, don't tell me I'm wrong. No,
That's
tell
true.
me I'm wrong. Let me know. I want to know. So
yeah, this is all about, like, we're not doing this because we are the scholars. We're doing this because we love the scholars and we want to learn more from them.
Exactly.
And we think that Hamilton has created a conversation where people want to learn. And we want to engage with people who want to learn. And we want to learn more ourselves. So we're actively understanding and admitting and confessing that we have not known these things forever. We are learning these things.
Yeah.
We know now more than we knew when we started this podcast. And in my book, that is the definition of success for us.
Yeah.
We have grown. We have been able to share a little bit of what we've learned. And so I hope that you've been growing through this as well. We've really appreciated it.
Yeah, and we love when you guys share information that we might have missed or maybe misunderstood or just not even touched on, because we love learning those things. So definitely, if you have information, historical information that you think is worth sharing with us or something you want to tell us, get in contact with us. We'd love to hear it.
And speaking of becoming a part of what we're doing here on the Graphomania Podcast Network with Hamilton the Podcast, if you are interested in actually supporting us financially through this endeavor, you can support this podcast, Hamilton the Podcast, and a number of the other podcasts we have on the network by going to patreon.com/graphocast.
Right.
And you can donate $1 a month and get exclusive content that we put out every month, or you could donate more than that if you want to donate $10 a month to commemorate the $10 founding father. That's totally your prerogative. We appreciate all of our patron supporters and the things you're doing. We want to celebrate you and acknowledge that you really are a part of what is happening here on the Graphomania Podcast Network.
So we'll see you next episode. We know.
We know we will.
Hi, I'm Sean Hancock.
And I'm Missy Hancock.
And I'm Vinton Bayne.
Together we are the Hancock Creative Podcast.
And we have a mission to encourage your creative soul. So we ask that you would come check out our weekly podcast and weekly pep talks, specially designed to encourage you.
The Hancock Creative Podcast is part of the Graphomania Podcast Network and can be found on iTunes, Stitcher, or at graphocast.com, GRAPHOCAST.com.